Hello and welcome to the AWS Summit Online. My name is Blair Layton. I'm the head of the database business for APAC and Japan for our public sector customers. Today I'm going to be going through database freedom and how we can help you break free from your legacy databases. The first thing we're going to cover is what's driving this change and what is making customers want to adopt a different database strategy. The next thing we're going to look at is self-service migrations and how the tools that AWS has can help you with your migrations. Then if you need assistance, AWS partners are there to help you with your migrations as well. We do have a database freedom program that's going to be able to help you, especially on the larger projects. And then we do have resources that are going to help you after this session that you can go and read up on and learn more about database migrations. So what is driving customers to adopt a different strategy? The first one is data growth. There is an explosion of data, and that could be data that you're ingesting from outside your organization or data that's being produced from your own applications. The key thing is you're needing more compute resources and storage resources, and of course the compute resources, if you're using commercial databases, need to be licensed. So as the data grows, there's more and more cost, and customers are now reconsidering what is their data strategy because of this ongoing cost increase. The next one is application architecture change. So most of the time, people have been developing monolithic applications. But now, as microservices are becoming more popular, then people are looking at their data strategy around this. And the reason is that each microservice is supposed to have its own data store or database. And again, if you're using commercial databases for that, the cost is going to be quite prohibitive. So that forces customers to start looking at different alternatives. And then the third one here is DevOps. So the DevOps mentality is that you are owning that code from the writing and the deployment and operations. Now, if your team is doing that, they're actually going to be doing development and deployment much more productively and releasing things more often, especially in a microservices world where they have full control over that individual microservice and they don't need to wait for the monolith to be built. Now that means there's going to be more and more changes to the database and the application code as that process happens. And relational databases are not that great in terms of being flexible around schema design and adding changes. So that means that customers are considering different types of databases for different jobs to understand what is the flexibility they can get, especially if it's going to accelerate the way they can develop applications. Now, how are customers adopting things on AWS? So you can see here that step one, you need to understand that you do want to break free from legacy databases. Once you've decided that, then often customers have a deadline around getting out of a co-location or data center facility, and they decide to move to managed. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's say you've got an Oracle database on-prem and you want to move that into AWS. Rather than running that on our virtualized environment, EC2, then you could put that into our managed database service, RDS. Now, RDS will allow you to then do all of the install of the software, provisioning of the hardware, patching, and so on. Now, once it's in AWS, then you can take advantage of the platform and decide, let's say that was an Oracle data warehouse that you brought in, you might then say, I want to move that to new technologies on AWS. Now, if it was a normal database, OLTP for a particular application, this is now where you could decide, well, I'm going to move this to either a non-relational or relational database that's on open technology to move away from the licensing constraints. Then when you're on those platforms, you're going to get better access to that data with more flexibility to get insights, and then that's going to drive you to the next step of coming back and looking at, hey, we got great results from doing this process. Let's go and look at another application and see if we can go and repeat that process again. So the top is all about moving to more data infrastructure that's more modern, it's got better storage, better networking, and the latest compute platform. But the bottom half is all about getting the most value from your data. So why do we want you to move to the managed database services in that first step after you've realized you want to break free from your legacy databases? Well, there is a lot of work that you do if you're not using a managed database. The first one is hardware and software installation. Then there's the database configuration, the patching, and the backups. After that, if you've got clusters, say always on with SQL Server or Oracle RAC, you've got to set up all of that environment. You've got to set up data replication, especially if you want to move data from one data center to another in case of a DR strategy. And a lot of that is quite complex. Then you've got capacity planning, and you've got to be able to scale those clusters for different workloads. Maybe you have seasonality in the way that your work happens, and therefore you get bursts at certain times of the year, and then you need to scale down after that. And of course, on-prem, you typically would have to purchase all of the hardware needed for that bursting period. So we want you to look at managed databases to take away all of that pain. And then if you're looking at some of your legacy databases and the concerns you have around that, you're spending a lot of money on those databases. They are proprietary and locking you into specific technologies. And then there is the licensing that is quite punitive, that restricts how many cores you can have and where you can deploy them. And then you often get email or a physical letter telling you that you're about to get audited. Now that process is quite expensive in two ways. It takes time from your team to go and help with that auditing process, and then you often get a large bill if you haven't managed to comply with the licensing terms and at the end of that auditing process. So we want you to break free with AWS, and we want to give you the services that are going to help you do that. So performance at scale is very important for these enterprise databases. And we want to give 3 to 5 times the throughput of what we can do with our traditional open source friends like MySQL, Postgres, and MariaDB. We want to make that cost effective, so it's going to be 1/10 the cost of commercial databases, and then fully manage to get the benefits, as we talked about, of having everything done for you. So you don't have to worry about patching, upgrades, and if there's hardware issues, that we're going to fix those on the fly. And that comes to reliability as well, to make sure that everything is safeguarded. We've got good security in place, encryption in transit, encryption at rest, and we've got the applications all secure. Now, there is a broad set of services, and this diagram does not actually include all of the databases or analytics services that we have at AWS, but it does give you an idea of the different areas. So if we look on the bottom left, we have Amazon Aurora and Amazon RDS. Now these are our relational database services, and you can see the relational databases that we support there: Oracle, SQL Server, MariaDB, MySQL, and Postgres. Then on the non-relational side, we've got support for MongoDB through Amazon DocumentDB, which is a compatible database with MongoDB. And then we have DynamoDB, which is an excellent database of ours with almost infinite scale for key value data and some document data as well. And then Amazon Elasticache, which allows you to do caching with Redis and Memcached engines. Now there are other databases, as I said, that are not here. There's a database called Quantum Ledger Database for ledgers. There's also Neptune for graph and others as well. On the data warehousing side, if you've got an Oracle data warehouse, Microsoft SQL Server, or Teradata for that matter, and you want to bring that in, then we'd recommend Amazon Redshift. If you are looking at moving into the Hadoop ecosystem and you want to use things like Hive, Impala, Spark, then Amazon EMR gives you the flexibility to use those tools as well. Next is Amazon Elasticsearch Service. So if you are doing log analysis, and that's primarily one of the big use cases that we see for this service, then that is a great managed service to take the burden of looking after your logs, searching through them and reporting on them and identifying problems. But that said, if you have a product catalog, let's say, and you just want to give the customers the ability to search through your product catalog effectively, then that service will also give you that capability. The next one is the Kafka managed service. Now this allows you to stream data in just as you would if you were using Kafka on EC2 or on-prem, and then you can use that as a managed service on AWS. And last but not least, we've got Amazon QuickSight as a visualization tool to help you visualize your data across these different services. So as I said, there's a lot more than what's on here, but this gives you an idea of the types of services and the categories that we have at AWS. So, self-service migrations. This is all about how can we help you do migrations yourselves. So we have two services. The first one is the AWS Database Migration Service. This is all about moving data between different data stores. It is not about converting the code in the database or the data types and the tables and so on. That is the next tool, the AWS Schema Conversion tool. So let's say you wanted to take an Oracle database and convert that to Postgres, then you would use the Schema Conversion tool to actually take the schema and convert it from an Oracle schema to a Postgres schema. And that includes taking PL SQL triggers and stored procedures and converting those to PL PG SQL in Postgres. So we will do the data type mappings on the tables and create the table definitions, move the constraints across and the code and transfer that to a native Postgres solution. But you're not going to be able to do that unless you use the schema conversion tool with the database migration service. So they're important to use together. So here are some different scenarios. The first one here with the database migration service is an Oracle database migrating into another Oracle database. Now this could be exactly the same version. Let's say you're moving from 12c on-prem to 12c in AWS. But you could also move between different editions. So for example, you might have Enterprise Edition on-prem, and then you might want to move to Standard Edition 2 in AWS to save money. You could also move between versions. So Oracle Database 11g R2 is coming to end of life soon. Then you might want to migrate that all the way up to 18c. You can do that with DMS as well. The next one is moving between different databases. So here you've got a scenario where you've got Microsoft SQL Server, and we're going to take that to Amazon Aurora. So the database migration service will map all the data types and move the data between the different engines to the target database. As I said, you've got to use the schema conversion tool to create that new schema first on the Aurora side. Then the last one there is with moving between databases that you perhaps have on EC2 or on-prem like MongoDB with a compatible database as a managed service in AWS. In this case, Amazon Document DB with MongoDB compatibility. Now on the right-hand side of the slide, we've got AWS Schema Conversion Tool or SCT. Here, this is going to help you assess the migration and give an assessment report, which we'll see some of that later. And then it's going to do that translation of the schema that we talked about. So very important tools to use in conjunction with each other. Now there are other options. So on the left-hand side of this slide, we've got DMS and SCT as we've been through, but there are native tooling options. So let's say you wanted to migrate a SQL Server database into AWS. You could afford some downtime. There's nothing wrong with using the .back method, taking that back up, moving it into AWS and restoring it into an AWS server. Now, if you don't have the downtime, that's where you could use database migration service to do that with almost minimal downtime as part of the migration process. Another option, maybe you've got MySQL and you want to move that into MySQL into AWS. Well, in that case, you could just use a MySQL read replica as a target in AWS and use the native technology to do that. That way you're familiar with the processes, you understand the technology, there's no need to introduce anything new. Now let's say you want to move from Oracle to Postgres. There is a tool, Ora to PG, and you can use that tool if you prefer. If you've got expertise around that, or perhaps there's a partner who has expertise around that, by all means go ahead and use that tool instead of using the schema conversion tool, for example. And then if you want to move data and you've already got commercial licenses for tools like Attunity, Oracle Golden Gate, Informatica, Talend, and others, then by all means use those. No need to go and learn the AWS technologies. But those AWS tools are there to help you if you need them. Now, once you've understood that you've got the report with the schema conversion tool, you've produced your new target schema, and you've understood how you're going to use the database migration service to move the data, the problem is you probably don't understand what is the difference between the source and the target databases. And to map these out, it's really important that you understand that the mappings are correct in what your targets are from SCT and DMS. And to do that, we have the migration playbooks. So there's a whole series of migration playbooks, and you can see there's Oracle to Aurora Postgres, SQL Server to Aurora MySQL, and so on. And the diagrams that you can see on the right, they describe the actual feature in the source database and the target database if there is an equivalent. And you can see green is mapped there, and that basically means that it's an equivalent feature. Orange, or that kind of needs some work, and then red is, oh dear, we have a bit of a problem here, and that's going to be requiring application rework to work around that capability. So this is very important if you're going to be doing this yourself. It's very hard to find people who perhaps say have Oracle skills and Postgres skills and understand both engines very well. So this book is going to help you with that knowledge and get you up to speed. So what I would like to do now is do a demo of the schema conversion tool, creating an assessment report. So we're going to break out and do that now, and then we'll come back and go through the rest of the presentation. Okay, welcome to the demo. What we're going to do here is take a look at how we use the migration assessment report. So I'm going to create a new project and use the wizard. And on this window, I'm going to use the defaults that come up for all of the information. And then it's got here, you can choose a transactional database, and it is because we're going to use Oracle. And then you can choose other databases in here if you want to. So these are the ones that are supported. And then it says switch to the cloud, and that's what we want to do. So we click on next. And then we've got to put in the connection information. So first of all, this is running on my local machine. We've got the default port. It's the XE SID, so the free version of Oracle. And then we've got the username and password. So once that's entered, then I can go and click next. And now it's going to load the schema information. So you can see these are all the schemas that are available, and we'll use the HR schema. So this is like a demo schema from Oracle. And then click on next. Now what's going to happen now is it's going to actually pull all of the information about this schema from the database into the schema conversion tool and do the actual conversions and assess how it's going to look. And now here is the report. Now this is the version that you get in the tool itself, and it's got an executive summary there. And if you go down, then you can see that there's graphs for different databases. So the first one here is for MySQL, and you can see the objects, the tables and constraints and so on. Most of those have converted quite well. And then there's some code things that also need to be looked at, especially the triggers. Then we can go down and look at some of the other databases, and you can see that's for Aurora. And if we go down a bit further, then we get to Postgres. Now you'll notice that for Postgres, all of the objects have been converted for the tables and procedures and so on. But then when you get down to the definitions of the code, then the trigger and the procedures actually have some problems. Now up the top right there, save to PDF, this will give you an even more detailed report. So what we're going to do is I've actually saved one of these before, we'll switch to that. And now you can see it's got the same executive summary that we had before. And if we scroll down, you'll see the same graphs as well for the different databases that we were looking at to give you an overview of the migration. But what we're going to do is go down a bit further, and you'll start to see that we're going to hit some code examples. So here we've got some of the schema objects, and this is around MySQL on how you actually have some of the problems that we need to do the conversions on. So this one's on triggers. Try using the for each row trigger because it doesn't support statement triggers. Only one occurrence, and the complexity to fix this should be simple. If we go down a bit more, then we should see, if we keep going, that we'll eventually get to some more here, which is unable to use convert functions, so there's some errors. And then if we go down a bit further, we can see this is on Postgres. So now we've got some dependencies on time zone settings. There's 2 occurrences, and that's quite simple. And there's a link to how you can look at that from the Postgres documentation, and it also shows you where these are occurring in the actual schema. Now, this is very useful, so you can actually get a better idea of how and where these conversions need to be done by looking at the Postgres documentation as well. So that gives you an idea of the assessment report. It's absolutely critical for doing your migrations.
Well, hopefully that demo was a good overview of the assessment report from the schema conversion tool. Now we're going to continue with the rest of the presentation. So we've actually had more than 200,000 databases migrated with the AWS Database Migration Service. And as you can see here from the customer logos on the screen, they're across different countries, different industries, and there's a lot of different people who are deciding to break free from their legacy databases and move to AWS. And one of these customers is JobVite. And they had a Microsoft SQL Server database that was not performing very well, and they decided to migrate that to Amazon Aurora. And as a result of that, they were able to lower their costs by 40% and improve customer response times by 40%. And I think they're quite good lowering the costs and increasing the speed, but also increasing the reliability of the system. Now, I mentioned at the start that we're going to talk about migration partners, and we've got a couple of slides that I want to talk about. The first one here is going to be about the migration partners associated with the database migration service, and then we've got another slide further on which is going to talk about some of the other partners that we have for different capabilities too. Now you'll notice here on the left-hand side that we have our partners to do migrations, and on the right-hand side we have AWS Professional Services. Now the reason for this is that as a customer, you might want to do it yourself, as we suggested, or you could get a partner to come and help you with that. And the partners here are an example of some of the partners across the world that we have, and there are many more as well.
But you may also want professional services to do the work for you, or perhaps a combination of using a partner and professional services together. And these are all options that are up to you and what you feel comfortable with. And we're very flexible about what is going to give you the best outcome. So feel free to discuss these options with your AWS representative. Now, another customer who's done a migration is DHI with a legacy database, which was a data warehouse system. And they moved this to Amazon Redshift as well as Amazon Aurora, reducing the costs and increasing the processing speeds. And I think this is, again, an example where you don't have to just map one database to another database. You can actually map one to a couple of databases, in this case, moving from Oracle to Aurora and to Amazon Redshift. So the Database Freedom Program. This is more of an enterprise scale program where we're going to help customers who have a large fleet of databases that they want to move in to AWS, obviously with their applications. And to do that, there needs to be an assessment and a whole lot of work that is required to make that seamless. Now, the way this is going to work is that we need to do an assessment. Now, obviously the SCT report that I ran and as part of the demo gives you an idea of some of the assessment tools that we will use to help understand what is the portfolio of databases that we are looking at. And then that will give us an idea with enough data of how we can produce a business case to give some direction of where we think the business should go. Now, once that's been confirmed that you want to move forward, then we move to a full analysis and pilot. And that's where we're going to look at really diving deep into the individual applications and database, understanding what their requirements are, coming up with a landing zone on AWS, training your people to make sure you've got the right skills in AWS and specifically around database migration as well. And then getting the right migration expertise in, whether that's with partners, ProServe, or training your own people. And then having that migration plan and a migration business case. Now in here, we may do a pilot to give you the confidence that this is actually going to work. And then once you've all got the plans together, we're going to move to the workload migrations. And again, this is an iterative process because the people who are involved in the project are going to learn as they go through and do the migrations. So again, it's another flywheel where you're going to get much better at doing these migrations over time. But this whole process has been proven and we understand how to do these migrations at scale and repeat them through your organization. Now, we also have investments from AWS to help you with this. So there's resources in terms of solution architects, ProServe, and the product teams if you really need to dive deep on our individual database services who can come in and give you advice and recommendations. We also have the partner consulting companies that we recommended before, and we can do investments with those partners to help lower costs. And we can also provide credits for our platform to help reduce proof of concepts costs as well as the overall migration costs. So we understand that this is an expensive process, that there is a high upfront cost to get to the rewards, and we're here to help you with that, to mitigate that upfront cost and try and smooth that cost over a longer period of time and really make the benefits and the return on investment come to you much faster. Now, as part of this assessment process, we have a workload qualification framework tool. And the idea of this tool is that as we understand more about your applications and databases, that we can then grade them according to different categories. And these categories are going to indicate to us what is a reasonable target for that particular database. So this tool can be used by our professional services to help you with understanding your individual databases as well as your fleet of databases. And then that feeds into the overall process of doing the actual workload analysis and deciding on the strategy for each of the databases. So here you can see that we have different database workloads on the left-hand side being fed into the discovery and planning stage, which is where we're going to use the workload qualification framework. And then the outcomes are there on the right-hand side. For some databases, we may refactor them and decide to go to our open source engines or a specific managed database service on AWS, such as DynamoDB. Otherwise, we might just bring databases in
and put them on our managed services such as RDS Oracle, RDS SQL Server, etc. But for some databases, and you can see on the left there is Oracle EBS or eBusiness Suite, that is something that we would have to deploy onto EC2 today to make that work in AWS. And obviously we're not going to be able to refactor that and change the backend database for that environment. So we have to take a holistic approach, understanding the different databases, the different applications, and decide what's the best outcome given your specific goals. Now, to help with the program, there's a few more different types of partners here who have done specific workload migrations. So there's partners like Clockwork, Virtusa, DBBest, who are very good at doing database migrations. And then there are also other partners who are very good at doing data warehouse migrations, as you can see there. And then at the bottom, a really important set of partners. So as you can imagine, as you're moving into AWS, you want to understand your license position, what licensing rights you have in the cloud, what strategy you should adopt, and how you should be negotiating with the providers of your database technology to make sure that you're getting the best outcome. Now, to do that, there are licensing partners. So we have Palisade Compliance, House of Brick, Software One, etc., who are going to be able to help you with the strategy of moving your licenses into the cloud to make sure that you're going to be compliant and that you're negotiating with Oracle and Microsoft and others with the best possible outcome in mind for your migration to AWS. Now here's another customer who has migrated successfully into AWS, Fender Digital, obviously a great maker of guitars. Now they relied on Microsoft SQL Server for its e-commerce business, and they needed a multi-purpose cloud-first database. And they decided to migrate away from SQL Server to Amazon DynamoDB with Amazon Elasticache and Amazon S3. So you can see here, again, using different database technologies instead of just having that single database. And the outcome there, saving 20% on costs and increasing the speed up to 50% and getting some fantastic feedback from their customers on this new application. And that's a great outcome. Summarizing what we've talked about today. So we started off with a discussion around why customers are adopting a database freedom strategy and reevaluating their whole data strategy. And that came down to the increasing data size that customers are having to deal with, as well as the adoption of microservices and, of course, DevOps. And then we moved on to talk about the tools that AWS has to help you with your migrations, including a demonstration of the schema conversion tool. And then we went and looked at some of the partners that AWS has to help you with migrations, including our own professional services. After that, we looked at the Database Freedom Program and some of the methodologies around enterprise scale database migrations. And then we talked a bit more about some of the different partners that you need in those types of strategies. And now I'd like to end with some resources that we have that can help you dive deep into some of the migration information. Now, the first link on here will take you to the database page at AWS, and that will touch on some of the databases that we've talked about today, plus introduce you to some of the other ones that we have, and then there'll be more information about videos, getting started guides, and so on to help you on your way. The remainder of the links here are basically focused on finding out more about migrations, including the Database Freedom Program. So feel free to take those down and click on them and find out more about what we've been talking about. Now, if you want to learn more about AWS, and I highly recommend that you learn the fundamentals before you take a gamble on a database migration, you have the option to do self-paced learning through online training, instructor-led learning in person, as well as get certified. And we've just announced a database certification, which we really recommended for a person who's going to be going down the database migration path. So that brings me to the end of my session. Thank you very much for attending the AWS Summit online, and please fill in the